Hey everyone, I just spent the last few weeks reading the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K, LeGuin, collected in the omnibus of the same name, and I thought I'd put them all together into one handy video. But because I don't like just outright recycling content, I've gone and reviewed each of the short stories and novellas individually too. And since this is basically one large review of the Books of Earthsea, as published in a single volume, the reviews are going to be in the order they are presented in the book, since apparently that's the intended way to read them. Let's get to it. Hey everyone, I just read A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it was great. Somehow both ahead and a product of its time. It's a book about a famous wizard known as Sparrowhawk before he was famous, and his upbringing, training, and greatest mistake as a young wizard. The prose? The world building and atmosphere in this book is fantastic. It is just a joy to exist in this world, and travel the Earthsea with Sparrowhawk, and it was great to see a world that outright rejects the medieval European fantasy template. Similarly, I loved that this book told a comparatively low-stakes personal story about a young wizard battling his personal demons. It was a nice change of pace from the usual epic high-stakes fantasy story that was common back then and is still common today. And I enjoyed how episodic this book was, how each chapter had its own supporting characters who would flit in and out of the narrative, its own antagonists, its own conflicts, while also adding to the overall narrative. And it didn't just make for a good plot, it really helped the setting come alive by framing the protagonist as just one person in this massive living, breathing world, as opposed to the world existing solely for the protagonist. The cons? This book is definitely a product of its time in terms of pacing and prose. The story starts with Sparrowhawk as a boy, but it doesn't really find its footing until he's a young man, and the way the tale is told is very dense by today's standards, which made it hard to get into at first. On a similar note, this book is classic fantasy in that it is an absolute sausage fest. There are about 3 women who are actually important to the plot, one of them is evil, and the other 2 don't actually do much, which I find a bit ironic given the author was herself a woman, though she did note in the afterword that this was by design, and given the time it was originally published, isn't all that surprising, it's just a nitpick. And this book ended so abruptly, it actually gave me whiplash. There is so much build up to the final confrontation, and the payoff is just not there in my opinion, but that's just me. I loved this book, and I'm really happy someone suggested it because I don't think I ever would have read it otherwise. It's definitely a bit old-fashioned in the way it's written, but the story is wonderful, and if you're a fan of fantasy, I'd suggest you give it a read, especially if you're tired of the usual medieval European template. And I'm giving A Wizard of Earthsea an S. Hey everyone, I just read The Tombs of Atuan by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it was very different, but it was also very good. What's most interesting about these books to me is how whenever I have a question about the world or the plot, the author usually has an answer in the afterword. It's great. It's a book about a young woman who is made into the first priestess for a cult of nameless absent gods in an old crumbling temple in the middle of nowhere, and her encounter with a certain wizard from across the sea. The prose? I love how this book is an inversion of everything the first entry was. Instead of a young man surrounded by men, the protagonist is a young woman surrounded by women. Instead of taking place all across the Earthsea, the setting is confined to the titular tombs. Instead of earning real power and it being liberating, the protagonist has useless power thrust upon her, and it is smothering. It was very different, but it was great. It was great to get a look at the Kargs and their culture given their framing as expansionist barbarians in the first book. The additions to the world building were fantastic, and it really helps create the sense that this setting exists beyond what's depicted on the page. And this story is just wonderfully constructed, it doesn't miss a single beat. The cons? I don't think it's really needed, but this book doesn't really have a present villain. The closest it has is Kossel, and Sparrowhawk himself for a fair bit of the book, and that's fine, but most of the story's central conflict is concerned with Tenar's internal struggles, and it wasn't until the very end that I understood why. So while I was reading it, the novel sometimes felt like it was missing an antagonist, but like I said, in hindsight, I don't really think it's needed. Like the previous book, this novel is written in a pretty old-fashioned style with a lot of tell-don't-show outside of the big moments, and it takes a little while to get used to. And the book has a pretty lengthy denouement relative to its page count, so that might be something to keep in mind, although it wasn't a problem for me. Minor issues aside, this book was great. It is the best kind of sequel in that it builds on what came before rather than repeating it, and I think I might actually prefer it overall. There were some things that stood out to me as a bit weird while reading it, but like I said before, LeGuin addressed them all in the afterword and I found her arguments convincing. This is a great read, and if you're a fan of fantasy, especially more episodic, less serialized works, then absolutely give it a read if you haven't already. And I'm giving The Tombs of Atuan an S. Hey everyone, I just read The Farthest Shore by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it was just a little bit too far for me, but it was still good. It's a book about the Earthsea where magic is going out of the world while the borders between life and death are growing thin, and only the Archmage of Roke and a Prince of Enlad can mend the imbalance and set things right. The prose? I loved the apocalyptic tone of this one. There's a lot of talk about the nature of mortality and the cost of immortality, and the way those two things are physically represented in the world was just great. Similarly, I really enjoyed the journey LeBanon and Sparrowhawk take in this book. Not just the places they go, but the way it affects them. It was a very moving tale. I absolutely felt the doorkeeper's last line. And Cobb was a great villain. He's such a tragic figure while being unrepentant in his actions. He's everything Sparrowhawk could have been if things had gone differently for him. The cons? I love the dragons of this setting, but the way they just suddenly become important to the plot at the very end comes a little bit out of nowhere for me. This book spends so much time building every other aspect of its main plot up that the dragons just felt a little sudden, despite how episodic the story otherwise is. After the Tombs of Atuan introduced a woman's perspective and a lot of interesting women characters, I was hoping that would continue here, but this book is back to being a men's club for boys overall, and it was a little disappointing. And I can't really describe what I mean when I say this, but there's just something about the book that holds it back from reaching the same heights as the first two. I don't know if it's just a little too much like the first one, or if it's some aspect of the plot that didn't quite click for me, or if the focus felt a little less clear, but there's just something about it that breaks the spell. That said, it's still a great read. If you enjoyed the first two, you'll probably enjoy this one, and it's pretty standalone, so if you're a fan of fantasy but don't want to commit to a long series, maybe check it out. And I'm giving The Farthest Shore an A. Hey everyone, I just read Tahanu by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it was fine. All of you are babies. There are much better things to get angry about than the politics of this book. It's a book about a young girl burned and abandoned by her parents and the new life she finds with her adoptive mother, the former first priestess of the Nameless, in the wake of the events of The Farthest Shore. The prose? I loved the more mature tone of this book. This is a story about adults with adult concerns, and it was great to view the Earthsea through that lens in a time of change. It was a welcome change of pace, even if the sudden appearance of swear words came at me like a slap. I also really loved how this book shines a light on the systemic misogyny inherent in a lot of the Earthsea's world that previous narrators Sparrowhawk and LeBanon haven't really noticed, by virtue of they being themselves men. The way one of the masters of Roke was dismissive of Tenar out of hand felt depressingly realistic. And once again, it was very nice to have a fantasy story with relatively low stakes. The world around them is changing rapidly and violently after the events of The Farthest Shore, but Tenar's biggest concern is just keeping her family safe. The cons? For a book ostensibly about Theru, she's not all that important to the plot, and isn't much of a character in and of herself. Tenar and Moss and everyone else left much more of an impression. Like a lot of the Earthsea stories, this book ends so abruptly after all that build-up, it felt like running right off the edge of a cliff. And I would have liked to have seen a bit more of the world after the events of The Farthest Shore than just the island of Gaunt, but this is just a nitpick. It's definitely different compared to the first three books, but after The Farthest Shore, I don't think the series could have gone back to the way it was before. It needed something more mature to move forward, even if that requires overturning the biggest rocks of the setting to have a look at the worms underneath. I've heard a lot of people find this one overly preachy, but I disagree. To me it feels introspective, and if you enjoyed the first three, I'd recommend it you give it a try, or a second chance. Just don't go in expecting the same sort of story, in the same kind of world. And I'm giving Tahanu an A. Hey everyone, I just read The Finder, the first story collected in Tales from Earthsea, and it was great. It also has my favourite sentence in all of fiction. If you know, you know. It's a novella about the founding of the School of Roke, and how it became the institute it is at the time of the main 5 books. The prose? Gellick and Early were both fantastic antagonists. Gellick because he's just completely nuts, and Early because he's so dangerous. They were great. I absolutely loved how this novella deconstructed a lot of the myths surrounding Roke and the magic system of the setting. It felt so depressingly real, and it was really well done. And I love the scale and scope of this story. It felt appropriately epic without outstaying its welcome. It was really well constructed and really well written. The cons? I kind of want more, honestly. It's the perfect kind of prequel in that everything is so far in the past it can't directly affect anything in the main books. I would have loved to have read more stories in this period of the setting. Like with just about every single one of these Earthsea stories, its resolution is pretty abrupt, and it is a pretty melancholy story, especially knowing what comes after in the main books. It wasn't a problem for me, but it's something to consider if you're thinking of reading it. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. It answers a lot of questions I had about the world, and it's just a good story on top of that. I'd easily give it a recommend if you haven't checked it out already, and I'm giving The Finder an A. Hey everyone, I just read Dark Rose and Diamond, the second story collected in Tales from Earthsea, and it was okay. definitely not my sort of thing though. It's a short story about the romance between a young man called Diamond and a young woman called Darkrose, hence the name presumably. The prose. The characters in this one were great. The relationship between Diamond and his father Golden felt crushingly believable. I really enjoyed how this story tears apart the myths of magic in this setting, like all the stories in this collection, and the relationship between Diamond and Darkrose was really sweet. The cons. The relationship between Diamond and Darkrose was also very frustrating. Overall, it doesn't really add anything to the series aside from its deconstructions of the mythology, and it doesn't have a great hook like the other stories in this collection do either. It's fine, but I didn't get much out of this one to be honest. You can tell by how short this review is, and I'm giving Darkrose and Diamond a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Bones of the Earth, the third story collected in Tales from Earthsea, and it was bittersweet, but it's always nice to see Ogion again. It's a short story about the time Ogion saved a town by stopping an earthquake, and the truth behind the myth heard in earlier books. The prose. Like with all the stories from this collection, I loved how it deconstructed a myth from the earlier books. Not only did it feel realistic, it felt very sweet. I really enjoyed the characters. It was nice to see Ogion as a young man, and Helith gave great insight into how he became the old hermit Ogion is in the main books too. And it was just wonderfully written. It's a very nice story. The cons? Aside from the characters and the writing, there isn't much to this one. Much as I enjoyed the deconstruction of the myth that's central to this story, it isn't anywhere near on the same scale as those deconstructed in the other stories. It was nice, but it felt unnecessary. And it took a while to really get going, which is a problem when it's already so short. It's fine, but I've never been a fan of short fiction. Give it a read if you're looking for more Earthsea, and I'm giving The Bones of the Earth a B. Hey everyone, I just read On the High Marsh, the fourth story collected in Tales from Earthsea, and meh, this one didn't do anything for me to be honest. It's a short story about a mysterious traveller who comes to a village in the middle of nowhere, caught in the throes of a livestock epidemic, and his healing powers that just might be able to save them. The prose. It was great to see Sparrowhawk at the height of his power again. It was a nice blast from the past. The mystery of the traveller's identity was compelling, I'll give it that, and the inhabitants of the town felt realistic and believable. They were good. The cons? This one just doesn't have an interesting hook. It didn't grab me, sorry. Of all the stories in this collection, this one felt the least necessary. I don't feel like it adds anything to the overall series. And I feel like this was just Tahanu again in many ways, without the good parts of that story. This is probably my least favourite Earthsea tale. I really didn't enjoy it, but maybe that's just me. It's part of Tales from Earthsea, so you might as well give it a read if you're going to try out the collection, and I'm giving On the High Marsh a C. Hey everyone, I just read Dragonfly, the fifth and final story collected in Tales from Earthsea, and it was great. Finally, some good food. It's a story about a young woman who comes to Roke at first at the behest of a failed wizard looking to spite the masters, and then by the merit of her own mysterious power. The prose. It was great to finally get some closure for the plot threads on Roke after mostly leaving them be in Tahanu. It was a very satisfying conclusion to that whole story, going all the way back to a Wizard of Earthsea. Thorian was a fantastic villain too, the perfect representation of everything wrong with Roke. And I really enjoyed Ilian. She's much more active than Theru or Tenar were in Tahanu, and it was great to finally have a woman stubbornly come to Roke to learn magic. The cons? This honestly could have been fleshed out into its own book. It feels a little wasted as a short. Like a lot of these stories, the ending was extremely abrupt. And once the story reaches Roke, the plot threads present in the earlier chapters are just sort of forgotten about, which makes sense I guess, but it also feels a little jarring. Minor issues aside, I really enjoyed this story. It feels like the knot of plot threads created by the end of The Farthest Shore have finally been pulled loose and the story can flow freely again from here. So I definitely recommend it. And I'm giving Dragonfly an A. Hey everyone, I just read Tales of Earthsea, a collection of 5 stories by Ursula K. LeGuin, and I'm still not a huge fan of short fiction at all. It's a collection of stories about the creation and deconstruction of the various myths regarding the setting of Earthsea and its magic systems, specifically the school of wizardry on Roke. The prose. I love how this book goes out of its way to tear down a lot of the myths that the setting took for granted in the earlier books. It felt natural, it felt realistic, it was really well done. The Finder was a great story with a great protagonist and a pair of great villains. I really enjoyed it. And Dragonfly was a fantastic story to end on with how it finally confronts Roke about its rules on not admitting women to the school. The cons? The middle 3 stories didn't really grab me, to be honest. They were well written, and I liked the characters, but they're just not my sort of thing. Many of these stories end very abruptly, which made the flow between them a little jagged at times. And if I had to pick a least favourite, it would be On a High Marsh. It just added nothing to the series. The first, third, and fifth stories were pretty good overall, even if the third was kind of unnecessary, but the other two were pretty meh in my opinion, and while the collection was decent overall, it definitely doesn't reach the heights of the main books. It's really not for me, but there might be something here for you if you enjoy short fiction and like the previous books, and I'm giving Tales of Earthsea a B. It's so close to an A, but it's just not quite there. Hey everyone, I just read The Other Wind by Ursula K. LeGuin, and it was a satisfying conclusion to the series. I'll be honest, I'm going to miss this setting. It's a book about a man who comes to Sparrowhawk looking to end his nightmares where he reunites with his dead wife, and the journey that leads not just him on, but the entire setting. The pros? This pretty conclusively ends the time of great change started in the farthest shore for this setting, and ties off all the remaining plot threads. It was great to get another look at the current state of the Kargish Empire, both in terms of culture and history. I honestly wish this part of the book had been expanded, and I really enjoyed how this book was told from multiple familiar viewpoints as well as a couple of new ones. It was cool to see how everyone interpreted the events of the novel differently, and it just felt like a nice send-off for these characters. The cons? Sparrowhawk isn't in this story all that much, which is kind of a shame because his absence is really felt throughout the rest of the novel. One of the aspects of Kargish culture introduced here that I felt was a bit one note was the inclusion of Muslim tropes, like how the High Princess wears a burqa. I don't mind it in principle, but it felt a lot less natural and a lot less thought out than the way the author blended a lot of non-Western cultures in the world building for the previous entries, and overall it felt a little forced, if that makes sense, but that's just me. And like with all of these stories, the ending is just so abrupt. Every single time it hits me like a slap. A few minor problems aside, I thought this was a satisfying conclusion to the story. It's probably not what everyone wanted, and if you didn't enjoy Tahanu or Tales, you probably won't like this one either, but I can't recommend this series enough, and I'm giving The Other Wind an A. Now that they're all out of the way, let's finish off this series. After The Other Wind is a description of Earthsea, and it was pretty stale. That's the problem with these world-building type stories. They're useful for the author, but a lot of the time they're just boring to read. It is, as the title suggests, a description of Earthsea in all its cultures and histories. The pros? It elaborates on a lot of mythic figures and legendary tales that are only obliquely referenced in the main books, which was definitely the best part of the work for me. It also presents a more definitive history of the archipelago and the Kargish Empire that is both informative and concise. You're not going to be trapped for several hundred pages reading about some fictional king's fictional peacetime, like a certain other world-building book I could mention. And it adds to the ongoing deconstruction of many of the Earthsea myths by pinning them down and examining them in a more distant academic tone, such as the comparison between men's magic and women's magic and how both impact their practitioners. It was really interesting. The cons? This work is completely superfluous to the overall series. It's useful if you want a little more detail given to the world building, but the setting stands well enough as it is presented in the books that I don't think it's really necessary. On that note, a lot of the stuff described is already present in one form or another in the main books. There is no secret lore hidden here. It's nothing you won't already have read before. And the academic tone is just so stale. I don't enjoy it in fiction at all. Overall it's fine, but I don't think it adds anything to the series, and you can probably safely skip it if you're not a super fan. And I'm giving description of Earthsea a C. Next we've got The Word of Unbinding, and it was an interesting look into what the series could have been, almost like peering back through the millennia into the Earthsea as it was before recorded history began. Crazy how much of the setting changed between this first original story and the main books. It's a short story about a wizard who is imprisoned by another, less cool wizard, and his attempts to escape from his confinement. The pros? Trolls! What happened to them? We'll never know, but they're here, and I love them. I love how this story foreshadows a lot of the conflict of the farthest shore. It's a great glimpse at the issues central to that story from a completely different and unconnected context. And I really enjoyed the conflict between the two wizards in this story. It was just a bit of classic fantasy in an otherwise subversive series. The cons? The story might share a few familiar threads with the Earthsea of the main books, but the world here is clearly very different, and it's hard to think of them as existing in the same setting, even separated by hundreds or thousands of years. While I do like that this story is just a bit of classic fantasy, Earthsea is at its best when it is questioning those old tropes of the genre, and there's just none of that here. And perhaps most damning of all, like so many short stories, it just didn't grab me. It's not bad, it's an interesting look back at the origins of the setting, but it definitely wasn't for me, and I'd only recommend it if you're super invested in the series already, and I'm giving The Word of Unbinding a C. Sorry. Following that is The Rule of Names, and boy did that ending come out of nowhere. I'm here for it though. It's a short story about the eccentric and reclusive wizard Mr. Underhill and the man who comes to his home island in search of the treasure the wizard apparently stole from a dragon. The pros, the twist ending. I can't say anything about it, but it was just so good. I loved it. I really enjoyed how this story ties into A Wizard of Earthsea, but once again, can't really say why. And I enjoyed how everyone in this story is just awful. There are no flawed heroes in need of personal growth. The whole cast are just scoundrels, and I love it. The cons? This story is written in a very old-fashioned way that just made it hard to click with overall. The story is nothing before its twist. Up to that point, I was thoroughly whelmed by what I was reading. And like with The Word of Unbinding, it clashes a little with the canon established in the main books, but that's okay, it's a nitpick. It's definitely worth it for the ending, but I didn't get much out of this story beyond that. Give it a go if you're a super fan of the series, and I'm giving The Rule of Names a B. It would have been a C, but that twist ending is just too good. It just scrapes by. Then there's The Daughter of Odrin, and it was an interesting look back at the Earthsea pre-introspection. I cannot take this story seriously after Eric Bana became the stone in Arthur Legend of the Sword. The idea is just ruined for me now. It's a short story about a woman who attends the Standing Stone and the history of how she came to keep her vigil, as well as what comes after. The pros? I really liked how this story was told, first by describing Weed attending the Standing Stone, and then the story of how the stone came to be, and then everything that happens afterward. It was really good. After so many stories in this setting of men being absolute scumbags to women, to the point where even the characters assume that to be the case here too, it was refreshing to have a story with a woman for the villain. It doesn't feel like a regression or a course correction on LeGuin's part, it just felt right for the story, and says to me Earthsea's second trilogy was not her preaching her views, but unraveling her own problems with the setting so that she could tell stories like this again. And I really enjoyed the ending, much as I cannot take some parts of it very seriously anymore. The cons? I can't take this story seriously. Like I keep saying, I just can't. Every time the Standing Stone is mentioned, I just get flashbacks to Eric Bana turning into a rock and piss myself laughing. Way too much of this story is spent trying to convince one of the characters that the villain is a noble woman and not the sorcerer on the island. It felt really self-conscious and pretty unnecessary. And I don't know, it didn't really add anything to the series overall, but that's just a nitpick. It's a good story, a nice throwback to the way the series was at the beginning, and if you're a fan of the Earthsea, you'll probably find something to enjoy here, and I'm giving The Daughter of Odrin a B. And last but not least, there's Firelight, the final Earthsea short story. The final Earthsea story, period. And it was appropriately bittersweet. I suppose it only makes sense that this is where the story ends, and I can't really talk about it without spoilers. So consider this your warning. Got it? Good. It's a short story about Sparrowhawk's final days. The pros? The story is suitably melancholy. It was a real tearjerker. It also felt very realistic. It didn't treat Sparrowhawk's passing as some big cinematic moment, but as a quiet, solitary one. And though it was quite sad, the story was ultimately a triumphant, reflective look back across the series and Sparrowhawk's life within it, something to be celebrated rather than mourned. The cons? I appreciate the realism with which the story treated Sparrowhawk's last days, but I do wish that he'd got the chance to give more of a goodbye to Tenar, given the two seem pretty aware of his failing health and coming end. On that note, I do wish a few other aspects of Sparrowhawk's life had been given a bit more attention and send-off, though whatever, that's just a nitpick. And this story just kind of sours what was otherwise the perfectly satisfying ending to the series, given In the Other Wind. I don't regret reading it, but I don't think it added much other than a bit of melancholy to the setting. It's a very bittersweet story, but I liked it for what it was. I'd recommend it if you made it this far into the series, you might as well. And I'm giving Firelight an A. I'm not going to review Earthsea revisioned because I don't do non-fiction or criticism, but since we're here, one more for the road. Hey everyone, I just read the Books of Earthsea by Ursula K. LeGuin, with illustrations by Charles Vess, a collection of every Earthsea story written over the decades, and it was great. I don't think we'll ever see another series like it for a long, long time. It's a series about the titular Earthsea and the reckoning all of its inhabitants are faced with when the magic starts to go out of the world. The pros? The world building is amazing, both in its original presentation in the first trilogy and the revised, more introspective and self-authentic presentation in the second trilogy. I've never seen a series build up its own legends and myths and then go to such lengths to tear them away so naturally in order to become its true self. It felt like I was reading the author in conversation with herself across multiple decades. decades, trying to resolve an identity crisis, and it was amazing. And I love the afterwards and asides and non-fiction essays included in this collection regarding the author's thoughts and feelings on the series over the years. Whenever I had a lingering question about one of the books, she almost always answered it in the afterwards. The cons? A lot of the stories are written in a very old-fashioned style that comes across as very tell-don't-show at times, and it makes it hard to click with them occasionally. A lot of these stories are very personal and introspective character studies, and that's fine, but I know that's definitely not for everyone, and even I feel the series could have benefited with a book or two about some kind of more classical fantasy conflict, though I understand the author's objections to writing about war. And most of the short fiction didn't grab me, but what else is new? This was a great series. I'd easily recommend it to fans of fantasy if you haven't given it a go already, and I'm giving the Books of Earthsea an A. And that's it. Every Earthsea story reviewed, and here they are all ranked. I had a lot of fun with this series. Thanks so much for recommending it, because I don't think I ever would have picked it up if somebody hadn't. Speaking of which, I'm always looking for reading suggestions, so if there's something you'd like me to read, post it down in the comments below. I will get to it eventually, I promise. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like, subscribe, and share the video around. I'd really appreciate it. If you're interested in overly long game critiques, I have a second channel, the link is down in the description. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.